The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle, creating a patchwork of light and shade that danced gently in the warm September breeze. Corporal Michael Davies stood at attention at his designated post. Near the castle's main entrance, his scarlet-red uniform immaculate and his tall bearskin hat positioned with the precision that came from 5 years of dedicated service as one of Her Majesty's Guards. Michael had always taken pride in his role as a Queen's Guard, understanding that he represented not just military excellence, but centuries of British tradition and honor. His position required absolute discipline, unwavering focus, and the ability to remain completely motionless for hours while maintaining constant awareness of his surroundings. Today felt like any other day in his distinguished career, with the usual steady stream of tourists gathering to photograph and observe the famous guards who protected the royal residence. The courtyard was bustling with the typical mixture of visitors that Windsor Castle attracted daily. Families from around the world wandered through the historic grounds, their voices creating a pleasant symphony of different languages and excited conversations. Children pointed enthusiastically at Michael's impressive uniform, while parents explained the significance of the Queen's Guard and the important duties these soldiers performed. Among the crowd was the Johnson family from Manchester, visiting Windsor Castle as part of their week-long holiday exploring England's royal heritage. David Johnson, a teacher in his mid-30s, walked hand in hand with his wife Sarah, while their 6-year-old daughter Emma skipped alongside them, her bright blue eyes wide with wonder at everything she was seeing. Emma wore a cheerful yellow sundress with white flowers, and her blonde curls bounced with each excited step she took across the ancient stones. The Johnsons had spent the morning touring the castle's state apartments, marveling at the priceless artwork and learning about the royal family's history. Emma had been particularly fascinated by the stories of knights and princesses, asking countless questions about castle life and whether real princesses still lived there. Her innocent curiosity and boundless energy had charmed everyone they met during their tour. "Can we see the guards up close, Daddy?" Emma asked, tugging on her father's hand as they approached the area where Michael stood at his post. David smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm, remembering his own childhood fascination with the ceremonial guards during a family trip to London years earlier. "Of course, sweetheart," he replied, guiding his family toward the viewing area where other tourists were already gathering. "But remember what we talked about earlier? The guards have a very important job protecting the Queen, so we need to be respectful and quiet around them." Emma nodded solemnly, though her excitement was barely contained. She had been talking about seeing the real Queen's Guards ever since they had planned this trip months ago. Her teacher at school had shown the class pictures of the famous red uniforms and tall black hats during a lesson about British culture, and Emma had dreamed of seeing them in person ever since. As the family joined the growing crowd of spectators, Emma's attention was immediately captured by Michael's impressive appearance. She stared up at him with the kind of pure fascination that only children possess, studying every detail of his uniform, from the gleaming buttons to the perfectly polished boots. Her small mouth formed a perfect circle of amazement as she took in the sight of this real-life soldier standing so perfectly still. "He looks just like the pictures in my book," Emma whispered loudly to her mother, causing several nearby tourists to smile at her innocent excitement. Sarah gently shushed her daughter while sharing a knowing look with her husband, both of them delighted by Emma's wonder, but mindful of maintaining the respectful atmosphere around the guard. The crowd around Michael's position continued to grow, as more tour groups arrived and individual families discovered the perfect photo opportunity. A group of teenagers from France posed for selfies at a respectful distance, while an elderly couple from Japan spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the tradition and discipline they were witnessing. The mixture of languages and cultures created a warm, international atmosphere that somehow made the ancient castle feel both historic and vibrantly alive. Michael remained perfectly still throughout all of this activity, his trained eyes focused straight ahead while his peripheral vision took in every movement and person in his vicinity. Years of experience had taught him to be aware of everything happening around him while maintaining the stoic presence that his position required. He had learned to appreciate the joy and wonder that visitors experienced when seeing the Queen's Guard. Even though his duty prevented him from acknowledging their presence, the afternoon was proceeding exactly as Michael had expected, with the usual parade of curious tourists and excited children creating a pleasant background to his ceremonial duties. He had no way of knowing that, within the next few minutes, his day would take an unexpected turn that would test not only his military training, but also his human compassion in ways he had never anticipated. As Emma continued to stare up at him with undisguised admiration, chattering quietly to her parents about the guard's magnificent appearance, neither she nor anyone else in the crowded courtyard could have predicted that this routine visit to Windsor Castle was about to become something much more significant, a moment that would challenge protocols, touch hearts, and create a memory that would be treasured by everyone present. The afternoon continued to unfold peacefully as more visitors streamed into the castle grounds, creating an ever-changing tapestry of faces, languages, and cultures around Michael's post. Tour guides led groups of interested travelers past his position, sharing historical facts about the Queen's Guard while visitors snapped photos and asked questions about the traditions they were witnessing. Emma Johnson had positioned herself at the front of the crowd, her small face tilted upward. As she continued to study Michael with the intense concentration that children bring to things that truly captivate them, she had been standing there for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally whispering observations to her parents, but mostly just watching in silent fascination as this real-life soldier maintained his perfect stillness. "Mummy, how long can he stand like that?" Emma asked in a stage whisper that carried clearly through the quiet air around Michael's post. Sarah Johnson smiled at her daughter's curiosity, while gently reminding her to keep her voice down out of respect for the guard's duties. "A very long time, darling," Sarah replied softly. "These guards train for years to be able to do this job. They're very special soldiers who protect the Queen in the castle." Emma nodded thoughtfully, clearly impressed by this information, and even more fascinated by the idea that she was watching someone with such important responsibilities. David Johnson had been taking photographs of his wife and daughter with Michael in the background, trying to capture Emma's wonder and excitement for their family album. The images would later become treasured memories of their holiday, showing Emma's pure joy at experiencing something she had only read about in books and seen in pictures, as the crowd around them shifted and changed, some visitors moving on to other parts of the castle while new groups arrived to take their place. The Johnson family remained in their position near Michael's post. Emma seemed completely content to stay there indefinitely, and her parents were happy to indulge her fascination with this living piece of British history. However, the peaceful afternoon took an unexpected turn when a commotion erupted near the castle's gift shop, about 50 yards away from where Michael stood. A woman's voice rose above the general murmur of tourist conversation, calling out frantically in what sounded like German. Her tone was unmistakably distressed, and several nearby visitors turned to look in her direction with concern. The voice belonged to Mrs. Ingrid Mueller, a tourist from Berlin, who was visiting England with her 5-year-old daughter Lily as part of a mother-daughter bonding trip. They had been exploring the castle grounds together, taking photos and enjoying the beautiful afternoon. When Mrs. Mueller had stopped to purchase souvenirs in the gift shop, in the few minutes she had spent selecting postcards and examining royal memorabilia, her adventurous daughter had wandered away. Now Mrs. Mueller stood outside the gift shop, her face pale with panic as she called out Lily. Lily in increasingly desperate tones. Her English was limited, but her distress was universal and unmistakable. Several kind tourists approached to offer help, but the language barrier made communication difficult, and precious minutes were passing while little Lily remained missing. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to her frantic mother, 5-year-old Lily Mueller had indeed wandered away from the gift shop, drawn by her own curiosity about the castle grounds. She was a petite child with dark brown pigtails and wearing a bright red coat that made her easy to spot in a crowd. Unfortunately, in her innocent exploration, she had become completely turned around and was now walking in the opposite direction from where her mother was searching. Lily spoke very little English, knowing only a few basic words she had learned in preparation for the trip, as she realized she couldn't see her mother anywhere and didn't recognize any of the surroundings. The little girl began to feel the first stirrings of real fear. The castle grounds, which had seemed magical and exciting just minutes earlier, now felt enormous and confusing. The tourists around Michael's position were initially unaware of the drama unfolding elsewhere in the courtyard. Emma Johnson continued her patient observation of the guard. While her parents enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere and discussed their plans for the remainder of their visit to Windsor Castle, the French teenagers were still taking photos, and the elderly Japanese couple had moved on to examine the castle's architecture. However, Michael's trained awareness meant that he had immediately noticed the change in atmosphere when Mrs. Muller's distressed calls began echoing across the courtyard. His peripheral vision caught the unusual movement patterns of people responding to some kind of emergency, and his years of military training had taught him to recognize signs of distress even from a distance, although his duty required him to remain at his post and maintain his ceremonial stillness. Michael's instincts were telling him that something was seriously wrong. The increasing urgency in the woman's voice and the way other tourists were beginning to gather round her suggested a situation that might require intervention. Though his protocols were clear about maintaining his position under all but the most extreme circumstances, as the minutes passed and Mrs. Muller's calls became more desperate, other visitors began to understand that a child was missing. Word spread through the crowd in whispered conversations, and people began looking around, more carefully hoping to spot a lost little girl. The cheerful tourist atmosphere was gradually being replaced by a sense of collective concern and urgency. It was at this crucial moment, as Mrs. Muller's panic reached a fever pitch and helpful tourists began organizing an informal search, that little Lily Mueller finally appeared at the edge of the courtyard, where Michael stood guard. The little girl was clearly disoriented and frightened, her dark eyes wide with confusion as she looked around at all the unfamiliar faces surrounding her. Lily's red coat made her easily visible as she stood uncertainly at the edge of the crowd, but she was still too far from her mother's location to be spotted by Mrs. Mueller or the growing group of people trying to help with the search. The little girl's lower lip was beginning to tremble, and tears were forming in her eyes as she realized she was truly lost in this vast, confusing place full of strangers. Little Lily Mueller stood at the edge of the crowd surrounding Michael's post, her small figure trembling as the reality of her situation began to sink in. The 5-year-old's dark eyes darted frantically from face to face, searching desperately for any sign of her mother among the sea of unfamiliar tourists. Her bright red coat, which had seemed so cheerful that morning when her mother had helped her put it on, now felt like the only familiar thing in a world that had suddenly become frightening and overwhelming. The little girl's limited English vocabulary felt completely inadequate for the crisis she was facing. She knew how to say hello and thank you, words her mother had carefully taught her before their trip, but she had no idea how to explain that she was lost or ask for help. Finding her way back to safety, the complex conversations happening around her in various languages only added to her confusion and fear. Tears began to well up in Lily's eyes as she took tentative steps toward the crowd, hoping that somehow her mother would magically appear. Among the tourists who were focused on photographing and observing the impressive guard, her small hands clutched at the sides of her red coat, a gesture of comfort that her mother had noticed she made whenever she felt nervous or uncertain. Michael, despite his rigid ceremonial stance, was acutely aware of the little girl's presence. Through his highly developed peripheral vision, his years of military training had taught him to process multiple streams of information simultaneously, and he could see the child's distress even while maintaining his required forward gaze. The way she stood, the trembling in her small frame, and her obvious disorientation all triggered his protective instincts in ways that his protocols had never specifically addressed. Emma Johnson, who had been so absorbed in studying Michael's uniform and disciplined posture, was the first person in the immediate crowd to notice Lily's presence. The 6-year-old's natural empathy and child's intuition immediately recognized that something was wrong with the smaller girl in the red coat. "Mummy, that little girl looks sad," Emma whispered to her mother, tugging gently on Sarah's sleeve to get her attention. Sarah followed her daughter's gaze and immediately spotted Lily standing uncertainly at the crowd's edge. her distress visible even from several yards away. "My goodness. She does look upset," Sarah said quietly to her husband, drawing David's attention to the situation. The Johnson family's parental instincts kicked in immediately as they recognized the unmistakable signs of a lost and frightened child. David began to move toward Lily, intending to offer help, but he was still several people away and would need time to navigate through the crowd. Meanwhile, Mrs. Muller's desperate search continued on the other side of the castle grounds. Her voice had grown hoarse from calling her daughter's name, and she was becoming increasingly frantic as each passing minute brought no sign of Lily. Well-meaning tourists continued to offer assistance, but the language barrier made it difficult for them to understand exactly what Lily looked like or when she had last been seen. Back at Michael's post, Lily had taken another small step toward the crowd, but her approach went unnoticed by most of the tourists who were focused on taking photographs and discussing the guard's impressive appearance. The little girl's situation was becoming more desperate by the moment. As her tears began to flow more freely and her breathing became rapid and shallow with the onset of panic, it was at this critical moment that Lily's innocent, frightened gaze met Michael's eyes. Despite his training to look straight ahead, the guard's peripheral vision allowed him to see the little girl clearly, and something in her expression of pure, helpless fear cut straight through his military discipline to touch his fundamental humanity. Michael had been trained to handle many different situations during his service as a Queen's Guard, but nothing in his protocols had specifically prepared him for the sight of a small, terrified child who clearly needed help. His duty required him to remain motionless at his post, maintaining the dignity and discipline that his position represented. However, his conscience as a human being and his instincts as someone trained to protect others were telling him something entirely different. The internal conflict Michael experienced in those few seconds was intense and profound. On one side was his military training, his sworn duty, the strict protocols that governed every aspect of his behavior while on ceremonial guard duty. Breaking from his position would be a serious breach of protocol that could result in disciplinary action and potentially damage. The reputation of the Queen's Guard, on the other side, was a little girl who was clearly lost, frightened, and in need of immediate help. Michael could see that she was too scared to approach any of the adults around her, and his experience told him that her situation was only going to get worse if someone didn't intervene soon. The longer she remained lost and panicked, the more difficult it would be to reunite her with her mother and ensure her safety. Lily took another tentative step toward the crowd, her small voice finally finding the courage to make a sound. "Mama?" she called out softly, her pronunciation of the German word for mother barely audible above the ambient noise of tourist conversation. The word was spoken with such heartbreaking hope and desperation that it seemed to hang in the air like a plea for rescue. Several tourists near Lily finally noticed her presence, but they were unsure how to respond to her obvious distress. Some began to approach her with kind intentions, but their movements seemed to frighten the little girl even more, causing her to take a step backward toward Michael's position. Michael watched this scene unfold with growing concern, training warring with his human compassion. He could see that the well-meaning tourists were inadvertently making the situation worse by overwhelming the already frightened child. His military experience had taught him that panicked individuals, especially children, often responded better to calm, authoritative figures who could provide clear direction and reassurance. The moment of decision was approaching rapidly. Michael knew that if he broke protocol to help the lost child, there would be consequences for his actions. However, he also knew that if he didn't act, the little girl would continue to suffer while her mother's panic escalated somewhere else in the castle grounds. As Lily's small voice called out, "Mama," once more with even greater desperation than before, Michael felt something shift inside him. The protocols and regulations that had governed his every movement for 5 years suddenly seemed less important than the immediate need to help a frightened child find her way back to safety in her mother's arms. In that pivotal moment, as little Lily's desperate call for her mother echoed through the courtyard, Michael Davies made a decision that would change everything. The sight of the terrified 5-year-old, standing alone and frightened while tears streamed down her small face, broke through every barrier that protocol and training had erected around his sense of duty and compassion. Without warning, McCall did something that stunned every person in the courtyard. He broke his rigid stance. The movement was subtle at first, barely noticeable to casual observers. But to those who understood the absolute discipline required of the Queen's Guard, it was revolutionary. Michael's eyes, which had been fixed straight ahead for hours, slowly shifted downward to meet Lily's frightened gaze directly. The change in his expression from ceremonial stoicism to gentle concern was so profound that it seemed to transform him from a living statue into a caring human being in the span of a heartbeat. Emma Johnson, who had been watching Michael so intently throughout the afternoon, was the first to realize what was happening. Her small mouth dropped open in amazement as she watched the guard she had been studying with such fascination suddenly come to life in a way she had never expected to see. "Mummy, look," Emma whispered urgently to her parents. "The guard is moving." Sarah and David Johnson followed their daughter's gaze and found themselves witnessing something extraordinary. The disciplined soldier they had been photographing was slowly, carefully stepping down from his ceremonial position. Michael's movements were deliberate and controlled, reflecting his military training even as he abandoned his prescribed stance. He held his rifle carefully in one hand while using his free arm to balance himself as he stepped off the small platform that marked his official post. Every tourist in the immediate area turned to watch their conversations, falling silent as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The crowd began to part instinctively as Michael walked slowly toward little Lily, his tall figure made even more imposing by his elaborate uniform and towering bearskin hat. However, despite his impressive appearance, there was something in his manner that was unmistakably gentle and non-threatening. His approach was careful and measured, designed not to frighten the already scared child. Lily looked up at the approaching guard with a mixture of fear and hope. In her dark eyes, her limited experience with authority figures made her uncertain about whether this tall soldier was someone who could help her or someone she should avoid. However, something in Michael's expression and gentle movements began to penetrate her: panic and confusion. When Michael was still several feet away from Lily, he did something that surprised everyone watching. He slowly lowered himself into a crouch, bringing his impressive height down to the little girl's level. The gesture was so unexpected and touching that several tourists in the crowd felt their eyes fill with tears at the compassion they were witnessing. "Lo, little one," Michael said softly, his voice gentle and reassuring, despite its natural authority. "Are you lost?" He spoke slowly and clearly, hoping that his tone would communicate kindness, even if Lily didn't understand all of his words. Lily stared at him for a moment, processing this unprecedented interaction with one of the famous guards she had seen in pictures. Her tears continued to flow, but she managed a small nod in response to his question. Confirming what everyone already suspected, Michael's heart went out to the frightened child as he saw her attempting to be brave despite her obvious terror. His own experience as an uncle to his sister's children had taught him how to communicate with young ones, and he drew on that knowledge as he continued to speak in the same gentle, reassuring tone. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, maintaining his crouched position so as not to intimidate her with his height. When Lily whispered Lily in response, Michael smiled warmly, the expression transforming his face in a way that made him seem completely approachable, despite his formal uniform. "That's a beautiful name, Lily," Michael said, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "Are you here with your mummy? Can you tell me what she looks like?" He spoke slowly and used simple words, hoping to bridge any language barriers that might exist. The crowd around them had grown completely silent, every person present recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Cameras and phones were being raised discreetly to capture this unprecedented moment. Though most people were too moved by what they were seeing to think about documentation, Emma Johnson tugged on her mother's hand, whispering urgently, "He's being so nice to her, Mummy. He's helping her find her mama." "Ah!" Sarah nodded, her own eyes moist with emotion as she watched this display of compassion that transcended duty and protocol. Lily, encouraged by Michael's gentle manner and patient questions, began to respond more actively. She pointed in a vague direction and said something in German that Michael couldn't understand. But her gestures and the word mama were clear enough to convey her meaning. Michael nodded understandingly and slowly stood up, extending his hand toward Lily, an invitation. "Would you like me to help you find your mummy?" he asked, his tone making it clear that she had a choice and wouldn't be forced to do anything that made her uncomfortable. The little girl looked at his outstretched hand for a moment, then up at his kind face, before slowly placing her small hand in his much larger one. The gesture of trust was so touching that several people in the crowd audibly caught their breath with emotion. "That's very brave, Lily," Michael said encouragingly, as he gently adjusted his grip to ensure her small hand was secure in his. "Let's go find your mummy together, shall we?" As Michael began to lead Lily away from his post, still carrying his rifle, but now focused entirely on his humanitarian mission. The crowd of tourists parted respectfully to create a clear path. Many were filming or photographing the scene instinctively, understanding that they were witnessing something special that deserved to be preserved and shared. The transformation in both Michael and Lily was remarkable to observe. The guard, who had seemed like an immovable statue just minutes earlier, was now displaying warmth and humanity that touched everyone present, while the terrified little girl was beginning to show signs of hope and trust as she walked beside her unlikely protector. Word of what was happening began to spread throughout the castle grounds as other visitors heard about the guard, who had broken protocol to help a lost child. People began moving toward the courtyard to witness this extraordinary act of compassion, creating a growing audience for what was becoming one of the most memorable moments in Windsor Castle's long history of royal ceremony and tradition. As Michael gently led little Lily through the castle grounds, their unlikely partnership created a wave of emotion that rippled through every person they encountered. The sight of the imposing Queen's Guard, still in full ceremonial dress, with his towering bearskin hat and scarlet uniform, carefully guiding a small girl in a bright red coat while she trustingly held his hand, was so unexpectedly moving that many tourists found themselves reaching for tissues or wiping away tears. Michael walked slowly and deliberately, matching his pace to Lily's smaller steps while maintaining a protective presence beside her. Spoke to her in gentle, reassuring tones as they moved through the courtyard, pointing out interesting features of the castle and asking simple questions to keep her engaged and distracted from her fears. "Do you see those beautiful flowers, Lily?" Michael asked, gesturing toward a carefully maintained garden bed filled with colorful blooms. "I bet your mummy would like to take a picture of you next to those flowers. What do you think?" Lily nodded, shyly, her panic gradually subsiding as she focused on the kind guard's calm voice and reassuring presence. The crowd that had gathered around Michael's original post began to follow at a respectful distance, drawn by curiosity and genuine concern for the lost child's welfare. Emma Johnson practically bounced with excitement as she walked beside her parents, repeatedly whispering about how amazing it was that the guard was helping the little girl find her mother. "This is better than any storybook, Mummy," her eyes shining with admiration for Michael's compassionate actions. "He's like a real knight helping a princess." Her innocent interpretation of the unfolding drama captured the fairy tale quality that many observers were feeling as they watched this act of kindness play out in the shadow of an ancient royal castle. Meanwhile, Mrs. Muller's frantic search had led her to the far side of the castle grounds, where she was becoming increasingly desperate as minutes passed without any sign of her daughter. Several kind tourists had joined her search, including a retired police officer from London who had taken charge of organizing the effort, and a German-speaking tourist who was helping to translate Mrs. Muller's descriptions of her missing daughter. The searchers had spread out across the grounds, checking gift shops, restrooms, and popular viewing areas where a curious child might have wandered. Mrs. Muller's voice was becoming hoarse from calling Lily's name, and her hands shook as she showed people photographs of her daughter on her phone, hoping someone might have seen the little girl in the red coat. Back in the main courtyard, Michael had begun to attract attention from castle security and other staff members, who noticed the highly unusual sight of a Queen's Guard walking through the grounds while not at his assigned post. However, as word quickly spread about what was happening, response was not disciplinary, but supportive. Captain James Morrison, Senior officer, responsible for the Queen's Guard detail that day, approached Michael with concern and curiosity. He had been alerted by radio about the unusual situation and had come to investigate personally. However, when he saw Michael carefully tending to the frightened child, his expression softened with understanding and approval. "Corporal Davies," Captain Morrison said quietly as he fell into step beside Michael and Lily, "I understand we have a situation here." His tone was professional but not disapproving. Michael felt a wave of relief that his superior officer seemed to understand the extraordinary circumstances that had prompted his actions. "Yes, sir," Michael replied respectfully, never breaking stride as he continued to guide Lily through the grounds. "This little girl became separated from her mother. She was quite distressed when I first saw her, and I felt immediate intervention was necessary." Captain Morrison nodded approvingly. "Quite right, Corporal. The welfare of children on the castle grounds is certainly a security matter that falls under our purview. Have you been able to gather any information about the child or her missing?" Guardian. Michael quickly shared what little information he had been able to gather from Lily, including her name and her limited indication of where she thought her mother might be. Captain Morrison immediately radioed this information to other security personnel and staff members throughout the castle grounds, coordinating a more systematic search effort. As they walked, more castle staff joined their small procession, including a member of the visitor services team who spoke fluent German and could potentially communicate more effectively with Lily if needed. The growing entourage created quite a spectacle, with the ceremonial guard at its center still, maintaining his protective hold on the little girl's hand. Lily seemed to sense that more help had arrived. Her confidence continued to grow as she walked surrounded by so many adults who were clearly concerned about her welfare. She began to speak more freely, mixing German and the few English words she knew as she tried to provide more information about her mother and where she might be found. The German-speaking staff member was able to learn that Lily and her mother had been visiting the gift shop before becoming separated, and that Mrs. Muller was wearing a blue jacket and had brown hair. This information was immediately shared with the search teams, helping to focus their efforts more effectively. As their group approached the area near the gift shop, where Lily had last seen her mother, a crowd of following tourists had grown to nearly 50 people, all drawn by the extraordinary drama unfolding before them. Many were recording video or taking photographs, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something special that deserved to be preserved and shared. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and hope, as everyone involved in the search began to converge on the same area. Castle staff members were coordinating their efforts through radio communication, while the growing crowd of tourists provided additional eyes and ears to help locate Mrs. Mueller. It was Emma Johnson who spotted her first. The 6-year-old's sharp eyes caught sight of a woman in a blue jacket standing near the castle's information center, clearly in distress as she spoke urgently to a staff member. "There she is," Emma called out excitedly, pointing toward the woman. "That lady in the blue coat looks like she's looking for someone." Michael followed Emma's indication and immediately saw Mrs. Mueller, her face etched with worry as she continued her desperate search for her missing daughter. The distance between them was only about 30 yards, but it represented the end of a journey that had transformed an ordinary day at Windsor Castle into something truly extraordinary. "Lily," Michael said gently, crouching down to the little girl's level one more time, "I think we've found your mummy. Can you see the lady in the blue jacket over there?" He pointed toward Mrs. Mueller while watching Lily's face for recognition. The little girl's eyes widened as she spotted her mother, and her face lit up with the most brilliant smile Michael had ever seen. "Mama," she cried out, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard and causing Mrs. Mueller to spin around in the direction of the sound, hope and disbelief warring in her expression as she tried to locate the source of her daughter's voice. The moment Mrs. Mueller heard her daughter's voice calling "Mama" across the courtyard, time seemed to stand still for everyone present. The frantic mother's head turned sharply in the direction of the sound, her eyes scanning desperately through the crowd until they landed on the most unexpected sight. She could have imagined her precious Lily walking hand in hand with the towering Queen's Guard in full ceremonial uniform. For a split second, Mrs. Mueller couldn't quite process what she was seeing. The relief of finding her daughter was overwhelming, but the circumstances were so extraordinary that her mind struggled to make sense of it all. Then maternal instinct took over completely, and she began running toward them with tears of joy streaming down her face. "Lily, mein Schatz." Mrs. Mueller called out in German, using the endearment that meant my treasure as she rushed across the ancient cobblestones. Her voice broke with emotion as 5 of the most terrifying minutes of her life came to an end with the sight of her daughter, safe and protected. Little Lily, upon seeing her mother running toward her, let go of Michael's hand and began running as fast as her small legs could carry her. The reunion in the middle of the castle courtyard was so emotionally charged that every person witnessing it felt their hearts swell with joy and relief. Mother and daughter crashed into each other's arms with such force and emotion that Mrs. Mueller nearly fell over, but she didn't care. She scooped Lily up into a fierce embrace, holding her so tightly that the little girl giggled and protested gently in German. Mrs. Muller's tears flowed freely as she covered her daughter's face with kisses, speaking rapidly in their native language while checking to make sure Lily was completely unharmed. The crowd that had followed Michael and Lily's journey through the castle grounds erupted in spontaneous applause, their clapping echoing off the ancient walls and creating a celebration that could be heard throughout the entire area. Tourists who had been complete strangers just minutes earlier were now united in their joy at witnessing this beautiful reunion. Emma Johnson was jumping up and down with excitement, clapping her hands and cheering as if she had just watched her favorite team score the winning goal. They found each other. They found each other, she exclaimed to anyone who would listen, her pure joy infectious to everyone around her. Michael stood nearby, watching the reunion with quiet satisfaction and professional pride. His decision to break protocol had resulted in exactly the outcome he had hoped for. Seeing the relief and happiness on both Mrs. Muller's and Lily's faces made any potential consequences seemed completely worthwhile. After a few moments of intense mother-daughter reunion, Mrs. Mueller looked up through her tears and noticed Michael standing respectfully at a distance, still in his full ceremonial uniform with his rifle held properly at his side. The realization that this impressive guard had been the one to help her daughter hit her with full force, and she struggled to find words adequate to express her gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you so much," Mrs. Mueller said in heavily accented English, her voice thick with emotion as she approached Michael while still holding Lily in her arms. I do not have words." She trailed off, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what this stranger had done for her family. Michael smiled warmly and gave a slight bow of his head in acknowledgement. "It was my honor to help, ma'am," he replied with characteristic British understatement. "I'm just glad we were able to reunite you with your daughter safely. She's a very brave little girl." At these words, Lily peeked out from her mother's embrace and looked at Michael with shy gratitude. She whispered something in German to her mother, who translated with a tearful smile. "Oh," she says, "you are like a knight from the fairy tales she loves to read." The crowd around them continued to grow as word of the heartwarming incident spread throughout the castle grounds. Visitors who had missed the actual rescue were arriving to witness the aftermath. The story was being retold by dozens of excited witnesses who couldn't stop talking about what they had seen. Captain Morrison, who had been coordinating with castle security throughout the incident, approached the group with evident pride in his subordinates' actions. "Corporal Davies," he said formally, though his eyes twinkled with approval, "I believe you've set a new standard for public relations between the Queen's Guard and our international visitors." The comment drew chuckles from the surrounding crowd, and Michael felt a wave of relief knowing that his breach of protocol would be viewed as heroic rather than insubordinate. His superiors understood that some situations called for humanity to override regulations. This had certainly been one of those times. Mrs. Mueller, still emotional but determined to properly express her gratitude, reached into her purse and pulled out a small camera. "Please," she said to Michael, "may I take a photograph? Lily will want to remember the kind soldier who helped her find her way back to Mama." Michael nodded graciously and posed for several photos with Mrs. Mueller, and Lily, his formal military bearing softened by the genuine warmth in his expression. The little girl had become quite comfortable with her rescuer and even managed a bright smile for the camera. earlier fears completely forgotten in the joy of being reunited with her mother. The impromptu photo session attracted even more attention, and soon dozens of tourists were taking pictures and videos of the scene. Many were already posting to social media with captions like "Faith in humanity restored," and "This is why I love traveling," witnessing moments like this. Emma Johnson, who had been watching everything with rapt attention, finally got her chance to speak to Michael directly when her parents approached to add their own thanks for his kindness. "You're the best guard ever," Emma declared with 6-year-old certainty, causing Michael to break into a genuine grin. "Thank you very much, young lady," Michael replied, giving Emma the kind of attention he had been trained never to show while on duty. "I hope you've enjoyed your visit to Windsor Castle today." Emma nodded enthusiastically, already planning how she would tell this story to her friends at school. As the crowd began to disperse and normal tourist activities resumed around the castle grounds, the story of Michael's compassionate breach of protocol continued to spread. Videos of the rescue and reunion were being shared on social media platforms around the world, with viewers expressing amazement and admiration for the guards' humanity and kindness. News outlets would pick up the story within hours, turning Michael Davies into an international symbol of compassion and duty. The video clips would be viewed millions of times, shared by celebrities and ordinary people alike, all touched by this simple act of kindness that reminded everyone that behind every uniform is a human being capable of extraordinary compassion. Mrs. Mueller and Lily eventually continued their tour of the castle, but not before taking several more photos and exchanging contact information with the Johnson family. Had also played a role in spotting Mrs. Mueller during the search. The two families would remain in touch, their children becoming pen pals who would always share the memory of the day. A Queen's Guard became a hero. Michael returned to his post with a sense of fulfillment that no amount of ceremonial duty could have provided. He had upheld the highest traditions of service, not by following regulations blindly, but by remembering that those regulations existed to serve humanity, not the other way around. For years to come, visitors to Windsor Castle would hear the story of the guard who broke protocol to help a lost child. Michael's actions would become part of the castle's unofficial history. His superiors would cite his decision as an example of how true military bearing includes the courage to do what's right, even when it means stepping outside the normal rules. The incident became known as the Windsor Castle miracle among regular visitors and staff, a reminder that even in our modern world, there are still people willing to put compassion before protocol and humanity before regulations. Little Lily Muller would grow up knowing that when she was lost and frightened in a foreign country, a stranger in a red coat and tall black hat had stepped down from his post to take her hand, lead her safely home to her mother's arms.